They said an alpha queen who couldn't bear children was worse than no queen at all. For 7 years, Selena Voss bled herself dry, protecting a throne that was never meant to be hers, while the man she called husband built a secret empire on her broken body and shattered dreams. One ceremony, one child, one blood mark that lit up the night and torched every lie she'd ever believed. Now the kingdom that once whispered behind her back is about to learn what happens when you corner a wolf with nothing left to lose. Stick with me until the end of this story. You're going to want to see how this queen burns it all down. And hey, drop a like and comment your city below so I know my pack is riding with me on this one. The great hall of the Shadow Peak Palace stank of old wood and older blood. Selena Voss stood at the edge of the moonline ceremony platform, her spine straight as a blade, her hands folded in front of her silk gown like she was praying. She wasn't praying. She'd stopped praying 3 years ago when the third round of fertility treatments left her vomiting blood in a marble bathroom, while the palace healers whispered about cursed wombs and divine punishment. The ceremony was supposed to be a celebration. Every 50 years, the kingdom gathered under the full moon to honor the alpha bloodline, to watch the ancient markings glow across the skin of true-born heirs. It was theater. It was tradition. It was the kind of pageantry that kept the nobles fat and the common wolves obedient. Selena had attended 6 of these ceremonies as Riker's queen. She knew the script by heart. What she didn't know was that tonight the script was about to catch fire. Riker Draven stood at the center of the platform, his broad shoulders draped in the crimson cloak of the Alpha King. He was a mountain of a man, all muscle and masculine certainty, with eyes the color of winter storms and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from granite by some vengeful god. The crowd loved him. They always had. He had that kind of presence, the kind that made weaker wolves drop their eyes and bend their necks without even thinking about it. Selena used to love him too. Used to believe that the cold distance between them was just the price of power, that the way he looked through her instead of at her was simply how kings learn to see the world. She'd been an idiot. The ceremony began with the usual prayers to the moon goddess, the same flowery language about strength and unity and the sacred responsibility of leadership. Selena tuned it out. She'd heard it all before. Instead, she watched the crowd, hundreds of wolves packed into the hall, their faces lit by torchlight, their eyes hungry for spectacle. Elder Morvain stood beside Riker, her ancient fingers gripping a staff carved from blackwood. She was older than dirt and twice as mean, with a voice like gravel scraping against bone. When she spoke, even Riker listened. "Let the bloodline reveal itself," Morvain intoned, raising her staff toward the full moon visible through the open roof. "Let the mark of our ancestors shine upon those who carry the true legacy of the Shadow Peak throne." The crowd went silent. This was the moment they came for, the part where the Alpha King's blood mark would ignite across his chest, a glowing sigil of power that proved his right to rule. Riker stepped forward, pulling open his cloak to bare his chest. The mark appeared almost immediately, a brilliant silver pattern that spread across his skin like lightning frozen in time. The crowd erupted in cheers. Selena clapped politely, her face a mask of serene approval. Inside, she felt nothing. She'd seen this display a dozen times. It didn't move her anymore. But then something happened that wasn't part of the script. A boy pushed through the crowd. He couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, small and scrappy, with wild black hair and eyes too old for his face. He was moving fast like he was running from something, and before anyone could stop him, he stumbled onto the platform and crashed right into Elder Morvain. The old woman staggered back, cursing. Guards moved in immediately, reaching for the kid, but then someone in the crowd gasped. The boy's shirt had torn in the scuffle, and across his narrow chest, glowing bright as a brand, was the blood mark. The same mark that only appeared on members of Riker's direct bloodline. The hall went dead silent. Selena felt her stomach drop into her feet. Riker's face went blank. Not surprised, not confused, just carefully, deliberately blank. And that was when Selena knew. That was the moment she understood that her entire life had been a lie. The boy looked terrified. He was trying to cover his chest with his hands, backing away from the guards, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal. And then, from somewhere in the crowd, a woman's voice rang out, "Kyle! Kyle, come here!" The crowd parted and a woman pushed through. She was younger than Selena, maybe late 20s, with honey-colored hair and a face that would have been pretty if it wasn't twisted with panic. She grabbed the boy, Kyle, and tried to pull him away, but it was too late. Everyone had seen. Everyone knew. Elder Morvain's eyes were sharp as broken glass. She looked from the boy to Riker and back again, and when she spoke, her voice could have cut steel. "Whose child is this?" Riker didn't answer. He just stood there, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance, like if he stared hard enough, the whole situation would disappear. The woman holding the boy started to cry. "Please," she whispered. "Please, we didn't mean to—" I asked a question. Morvain's voice cracked like a whip. "Whose child is this?" Selena felt like she was watching the scene from underwater. Everything was muffled and slow and wrong. She looked at Riker, waiting for him to say something, to explain, to do anything that would make this make sense. He finally spoke, and his voice was flat. "He's mine." The hall exploded. Wolves shouting, nobles yelling over each other, guards trying to restore order. Selena heard none of it. She was looking at the woman holding the boy, really looking at her for the first time, and she recognized her. Lyanna Vale, one of the palace attendants. A nobody. A shadow who'd moved through the halls for years, invisible and unremarkable. Except she wasn't a nobody. She was the mother of Riker's secret heir. Selena's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her stomach, trying to hold herself together, trying not to scream or collapse, or do any of the things her body suddenly wanted to do. Riker turned to look at her for the first time that night. His expression was unreadable. "Selena, don't!" The word came out sharper than she intended. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her, waiting to see how the Baron Queen would react to the ultimate humiliation. She forced herself to smile, cold and bright. "We'll discuss this later." She turned and walked off the platform, her head high, her steps measured and precise. She made it out of the great hall. She made it down 2 corridors. She made it into a small, unused chamber before her legs gave out, and she hit the floor hard enough to bruise her knees through the silk. Then she threw up. Everything she'd eaten that day came back up in a violent rush, her body rejecting the world just as thoroughly as the world had rejected her. When she was done, she stayed on the floor, gasping, her forehead pressed against the cool stone. She could still hear the chaos from the great hall, muffled but relentless. 7 years. 7 years she'd stood beside him. 7 years she'd endured the whispers and the pitying looks and the endless treatments that left her body bruised and aching. 7 years she'd believed the lie that they were partners, that they were building something together. And all that time, he'd had a son. A knock on the door made her flinch. She didn't answer, didn't move. Hoped whoever it was would just go away. The door opened anyway. Of course it did. "My queen." The voice was soft, careful. Maris, her personal attendant. One of the few people in the palace who'd never looked at Selena like she was broken. "I brought water." Selena pushed herself up slowly, accepting the cup with hands that still trembled. She drank, rinsed the sour taste from her mouth, and spat into a basin Maris held ready. "Thank you," Selena managed. Her voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. Maris hesitated, then spoke quietly. "The Alpha King is looking for you." "I'm sure he is." "He's dismissed the ceremony, sent everyone home. The council is gathering." Of course they were. Damage control, strategy sessions, all the rats scrambling to figure out how to spin this disaster into something manageable. Selena stood, smoothing her gown with shaking hands. "Help me fix my face." Maris worked quickly, wiping away the tear tracks Selena hadn't realized were there, adjusting her hair, making her look like a queen again instead of a woman who'd just had her heart ripped out in front of an audience. When Selena finally made her way to the council chamber, she could hear voices through the door. Loud voices, angry voices. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The argument stopped instantly. A dozen faces turned toward her, and the room filled with the kind of heavy silence that meant everyone had been talking about her right before she walked in. Riker stood at the head of the long table, his hands braced against the wood like he was holding himself up. Elder Morvain sat to his right, her expression carved from ice. The other council members, Lord Theron, Lady Cassia, Commander Dain, all looked various shades of uncomfortable. And in the corner, trying to make herself invisible, was Lyanna Vale. Selena's eyes locked on the woman for a long moment. Lyanna couldn't meet her gaze. "Good," Selena, Riker's voice was rough. Sit down. We need to talk. No. She stayed standing, her hands folded in front of her. You need to talk. I need to listen. For once, let's be honest about the power dynamic here. Lord Theron cleared his throat. My queen, perhaps. Shut up, Theron. Selena didn't even look at him. She kept her eyes on Riker. How long? Riker's jaw tightened. Selena, how long? He was silent for a moment, then quietly. 9 years. 9 years. The boy was 8, which meant Riker had been sleeping with Lyanna before he'd even finished courting Selena. Probably before their marriage. Definitely before she'd started torturing herself with fertility treatments. Selena laughed. It was a broken, jagged sound. 9 years? So when you were telling me we'd have children someday, when you were holding my hand through every failed treatment, when you were promising me we'd build a legacy together, you already had a son. It wasn't like that. Then what was it like, Riker? Explain it to me. Make me understand. He ran a hand through his hair, and for the first time she could remember, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. The kingdom was unstable. My father had just died. The northern clans were threatening succession challenges. I needed an heir. Elder Morvain's voice cut through the room. He needed a true-born heir to secure his claim, and you, my dear, were not providing one. Selena turned slowly to look at the old woman. I wasn't aware I'd been on a timeline. Morvain's smile was thin and cruel. Every queen is on a timeline. That's the job. You produce heirs or you get replaced. Basic biology. And you knew about this. It wasn't a question. Selena could see it in the elder's eyes. You all knew. She looked around the table. Theron wouldn't meet her gaze. Cassia was examining her fingernails. Commander Diane at least had the decency to look ashamed. It was decided, Morvain said calmly, that protecting the stability of the kingdom was more important than protecting your feelings. The boy was kept secret to avoid exactly this kind of chaos. If you hadn't been so insistent on your own importance, perhaps what? Selena's voice went dangerously soft. Perhaps I should have accepted that my husband was keeping a whole other family hidden while I bled myself trying to give him what he already had. Perhaps I should have thanked him for the privilege of public humiliation. Selena. Riker finally moved, coming around the table toward her. I never wanted to hurt you, but I had to think about the kingdom, about my responsibilities. She laughed again, backing away from him. Your responsibilities. Right. And what was I, exactly? Your pet? Your placeholder? The barren bitch you kept around for show while you built your real family in secret? That's not fair. Fair. Her voice rose. You want to talk about fair? I gave you 7 years, Riker. 7 years of my life. I stood beside you through every political fight, every challenge to your authority. I defended you when the other queens called you weak. I smiled through every God's damned ceremony and banquet and council meeting, and all that time you were lying to me. I protected you, he said, and he actually sounded like he believed it. If the other clans had known about Kael, they would have used him against us, against you. I was trying to keep you safe. Safe. Selena tasted the word like poison. You think I feel safe right now? You think I feel protected? Lyanna spoke up from her corner, her voice barely audible. Your Majesty, I never meant... Don't. Selena cut her off with a look that could have drawn blood. Don't you dare speak to me. You don't get to apologize or explain or make yourself feel better. You knew exactly what you were doing. Lyanna's eyes filled with tears, but Selena felt nothing. No pity, no sympathy, just a cold, hollow rage that was starting to fill every empty space inside her. Elder Morvain stood, leaning on her staff. Regardless of the emotional theatrics, we have a practical problem. The kingdom has now seen proof of an heir who cannot be ignored or hidden. We need to address the succession. The succession. Selena repeated the words slowly, understanding dawning. You're going to legitimize him. It's the logical solution, Theron said, finally finding his voice. The boy has the blood mark. He's clearly Riker's son. With proper training and education. And what happens to me? Selena asked. Do I just disappear? Step aside gracefully so you can install your backup queen and pretend the last 7 years never happened? The silence that followed was answer enough. Commander Dain at least tried to soften it. You would retain your title and honors, of course. A generous estate. Full household staff. You'd want for nothing. Except my husband. Except my position. Except every single thing I've worked for. You'd have your dignity, Morvain said coldly, which is more than most women in your position could hope for. Selena looked at each of them in turn, saw the calculation in their eyes, saw how easily they'd already written her out of the story. Then she looked at Riker, really looked at him, and saw nothing. No guilt, no remorse, just the same cold pragmatism he'd shown her for 7 years. I need air, she said finally. She walked out before anyone could stop her, made it to the outer courtyard before her carefully maintained composure finally cracked. Maris found her there an hour later, sitting on the edge of a fountain with her shoes off and her hair falling out of its careful arrangement. The attendant didn't say anything, just sat down beside her. They're going to replace me, Selena said to the night air. They've probably already started the paperwork. Maris was quiet for a moment, then, what will you do? It was a good question. What would she do? She could accept exile with dignity, take her estate and her title, and fade into comfortable obscurity. She could fight and lose, make herself look desperate and pathetic in front of the entire kingdom. Or she could what? I don't know yet, Selena admitted, but I'm not disappearing quietly. I'm done being convenient. She stood up, barefoot on the cold stone, and looked back at the palace, the lights blazing in every window, the guards at every door, the weight of centuries of tradition and power pressing down on everything. She'd spent 7 years holding that weight on her shoulders, protecting it, serving it. Maybe it was time to let it fall. Maris, she said quietly, I need you to do something for me. Anything, my queen. Stop calling me that. Selena turned to face her. And start helping me find everyone Riker has ever screwed over, every noble he's cheated, every alliance he's broken, every secret he's buried. I want names. I want evidence. I want everything. Maris's eyes widened. My lady, if I'm caught, I'm already finished anyway. Selena smiled, and it was the first real smile she'd managed all night. But if I'm going down, I'm taking the whole damn kingdom with me. The next morning came too fast and not fast enough. Selena hadn't slept. She'd spent the night in her private chambers going through 7 years of correspondence, financial records, anything she could find that might contain a crack in Riker's carefully constructed empire. Maris had helped until exhaustion forced her to rest, but Selena kept going, her eyes burning, her fingers ink-stained, her mind sharp with the kind of clarity that only comes from pure survival instinct. She found the first thread around dawn, a series of payments to a northern clan lord named Varen Blackwater. Large payments. Regular payments. Starting exactly 3 months before Riker's father died, and continuing right up until 2 years ago when Blackwater's entire family was killed in what the official reports called a hunting accident. Selena stared at the numbers until they burned into her brain. Blackwater had been one of the strongest voices calling for succession challenges after the old king's death. He'd had a legitimate claim to the throne through his mother's bloodline. And then he'd gone quiet, taken money, lots of money. And then he died conveniently right around the time those payments stopped. She made notes in a leather journal, her handwriting getting messier as exhaustion and adrenaline fought for control of her hands. This was something. This was leverage. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. A knock at her door made her jump. She shoved the journal under a cushion and called out. It was one of the palace guards. Young kid, barely old enough to grow a proper beard, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Your presence is requested in the Alpha King's private study, Your Majesty. Requested, like she had a choice. She washed her face, changed into a simple day dress, and made her way through the palace corridors. Wolves stepped aside as she passed, their eyes sliding away from hers. Nobody wanted to be associated with the queen who was about to be replaced. Political survival meant picking the winning side early, and Selena wasn't winning anymore. She'd never felt more alone in her life. Riker's study was on the 3rd floor of the East Wing, a room lined with books he'd never read and weapons he'd never used in actual combat. He was standing by the window when she entered, his back to her, silhouetted against the morning light. Close the door, he said without turning around. She did. stayed standing near it, keeping distance between them. He finally turned to face her, and she saw that he looked tired. Good. She hoped he hadn't slept either, hoped guilt was eating him alive, though she doubted it. Guilt required a conscience, and she was starting to suspect Riker had traded his for a crown years ago. We need to discuss how this is going to work, he said. How what is going to work? Make your humiliation of me official? Draft the decree that erases me from history. Something flickered in his eyes. Annoyance, maybe. Or just impatience. Don't be dramatic. Nobody's erasing you, just replacing me. There's a difference, I'm sure. He moved to his desk, poured himself a drink from a crystal decanter. Didn't offer her one. The small cruelty felt deliberate. The council has decided that Kael will be formally recognized as my heir. He'll begin his education immediately. Liana will remain in the palace as his mother and your mistress. Say it, Riker. Stop hiding behind politics and just say what she is. His jaw tightened. She'll have quarters appropriate to her position. Which is what exactly? Royal whore? Official side piece? Or are you going to marry her once you're done with me? The words came out sharp and ugly, and Selena didn't care. She wanted to hurt him, wanted to make him feel even a fraction of what she was feeling. I'm not divorcing you, he said flatly. You'll remain queen in name. The kingdom needs stability, and a divorce would make you look weak. She laughed bitterly. Of course. Can't have that. So I get to stay queen of nothing while your real family lives down the hall. How generous. Selena. His voice dropped into that tone he used when he wanted to sound reasonable, when he wanted her to be the calm one, the understanding one, the one who put the kingdom first. I know you're hurt, but this is bigger than us. The bloodline. The bloodline you hid from me for 9 years while I destroyed my body, trying to give you what you already had. She stepped toward him, her voice rising. Do you have any idea what those treatments did to me? The pain, the sickness, the shame every time another one failed? I never asked you to do that. You didn't have to ask. Every time you looked at me, every time the council brought up succession, every time some visiting dignitary made a comment about the empty nursery, that was you asking. That was you making me feel like I wasn't enough. He set his glass down hard enough to crack. I did what I had to do to protect this kingdom. If you can't understand that, I understand perfectly. She was close enough now to see the gold flecks in his winter storm eyes, close enough to smell the whiskey on his breath. You're a coward who couldn't admit the truth because it would have complicated your life. So you let me suffer. Let me think I was the problem. And now you want me to just accept it and smile and play the dutiful queen while you parade your real family in front of everyone. What do you want from me, Selena? The question came out rough, almost desperate. You want an apology? Fine. I'm sorry. You want me to say I handled it badly? I handled it badly, but it's done. It's over. We move forward from here. She stared at him for a long moment, really looked at him, maybe for the first time in years. Saw the lines around his eyes, the gray starting to thread through his dark hair, the way he held himself like a man carrying weight he couldn't put down. And she felt nothing. No love, no hate, just cold calculation. You're right, she said quietly. It's over. She turned and walked out before he could respond. Maris was waiting in the corridor outside, looking anxious. My lady, Elder Morvain wants to see you. Of course she does. The Elder's chambers were in the oldest part of the palace, a suite of rooms that smelled like incense and old parchment and something else Selena couldn't quite identify. Death, maybe. Or just the accumulated weight of too many years. Morvain sat in a high-backed chair that looked like a throne, her gnarled hands resting on her blackwood staff. Her eyes were sharp despite her age, and they tracked Selena like a hawk watching prey. Sit, child. Selena sat, kept her spine straight, her hands folded, her face neutral. The elder studied her for a moment. You're angry. I'm devastated. There's a difference. A thin smile. Is there? Anger, grief, humiliation, they all lead to the same place eventually. Bad decisions made in the heat of emotion. If you're here to lecture me about accepting my fate gracefully, I'm here to offer you a choice. Morvain's voice went cold. You can accept what's coming with dignity, take your estate and your title, and live out the rest of your life in comfort. Or you can fight, make a spectacle of yourself, and lose everything, including your reputation. What makes you think I'd lose? Because you have no power here. The elder leaned forward slightly. You were never more than an ornament, girl. A pretty face to stand beside the king and smile at ceremonies. You have no bloodline claim, no military support, no wealth of your own. Nothing. Riker could strip your title tomorrow and not a single wolf in this kingdom would lift a claw to defend you. The words hit like physical blows, each one designed to land in the softest spots. Selena forced herself to breathe slowly, evenly, to not show the elder how deep those cuts went. Then why offer me a choice at all? If I'm so powerless, why not just throw me out? Morvain sat back. Because I've lived long enough to know that cornered animals bite. And I'd rather avoid the mess. Take the estate, Selena. Take the title. Walk away while you still can. And if I don't, then you'll learn a very painful lesson about the difference between being a queen and having power. Selena stood. Thank you for your concern, Elder. I'll consider my options. She left before Morvain could respond, her heart hammering against her ribs, her hands shaking with suppressed rage. Maris caught up with her halfway down the corridor. My lady, what did she say? She threatened me. Very politely, very elegantly. But it was a threat. What will you do? Selena kept walking, her mind racing. What will I do? I'm going to find every dirty secret this palace is hiding, and then I'm going to burn it all down. The library was her next stop. The palace library was enormous. 3 floors of books and documents and historical records that nobody ever read. Perfect place to hide things in plain sight. She spent hours there, pulling dusty volumes from forgotten shelves, cross-referencing dates and names and events. Maris helped when she could, but mostly just kept watch to make sure nobody interrupted them. By midday, Selena had found 2 more threads. The first was a land dispute from 6 years ago. A powerful family in the Southern Territories had been stripped of their holdings after the patriarch was accused of treason. The evidence had been thin, the trial fast, the execution faster. And 3 months later, those lands had been quietly transferred to one of Riker's most loyal supporters. The second was even more interesting. A series of letters between Riker and Elder Morvain discussing something called the Succession Protocol. The language was careful, coded, but Selena could read between the lines. They'd been planning for the possibility of Riker's death or removal, and the protocol involved bypassing traditional inheritance laws to install a hand-picked successor, which meant they'd been planning to control the throne regardless of who sat on it. She copied everything into her journal, her handwriting getting faster and sloppier. This was good. This was ammunition. But she needed more, needed something undeniable. My lady. Maris's voice was urgent. Someone's coming. Selena shoved the journal inside her dress and grabbed the nearest book at random, trying to look casual. The library door opened and Commander Dain walked in. He was a big man, all scars and muscle and gray hair, with eyes that had seen too many battles. He'd served Riker's father before him, and he had the kind of loyalty that came from decades of shared blood. Your Majesty. His voice was gruff but not unkind. I thought I might find you here. Commander? She kept her tone neutral. Is there something you need? He glanced at Maris, then back at Selena. A word in private, if you don't mind. Maris looked at Selena, who nodded. The attendant left, closing the door behind her. Dain moved closer, his heavy boots loud on the stone floor. He didn't sit, just stood there looking uncomfortable, like a man trying to figure out how to deliver bad news. I wanted to apologize, he said finally, for last night, for not speaking up when I should have. Selena waited. Silence was a weapon too. He rubbed the back of his neck. I've known Riker since he was a boy. Watched him grow up, trained him myself, and I've seen him make a lot of decisions over the years, some good, some not so good. This one, he shook his head. This one was wrong, the way he handled it. What he put you through. It was wrong, but you didn't say anything. No, I didn't. His voice was heavy with something that might have been shame. Because I'm a soldier, Your Majesty. I follow orders. I protect the throne. And sometimes that means swallowing things that stick in your throat. She studied him carefully. He seemed genuine, but genuine didn't mean trustworthy. Everyone in this palace had an angle. Why are you telling me this now? Because I think you deserve better than what you're getting, and because... He paused, choosing his words. Because I've seen what happens when good people get pushed too far, and I'd hate to see you do something you can't take back. There it was, the real reason. He wasn't apologizing out of guilt. He was warning her. What exactly do you think I'm going to do, Commander? I think you're smart. I think you're angry. And I think you're digging into things that powerful people would prefer stayed buried. He met her eyes directly. And I'm telling you, as someone who doesn't want to see you hurt, that you should stop. Or what? Or you'll find out that there are worse things than public humiliation. The threat was clear despite the careful wording. Selena felt ice slide down her spine, but she kept her expression calm. Thank you for your concern, Commander. I'll take it under advisement. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something in his eyes that might have been respect or pity. Hard to tell. You're braver than most, I'll give you that. Just make sure you're not braver than you are smart. He left without another word. Selena waited until his footsteps faded before letting out the breath she'd been holding. Her hands were shaking again. The commander's visit had rattled her more than she wanted to admit, but it also confirmed something important. She was on to something, and they knew it. Maris slipped back in. My lady, are you all right? No, but I'm not stopping. That evening, a formal announcement went out to the entire kingdom. Kael Draven, son of Alpha King Riker Draven, was hereby recognized as the legitimate heir to the Shadow Peak throne. There would be a ceremony in 3 days to formally present him to the noble houses. Selena heard about it from a servant. Nobody had bothered to tell her directly. She stood in her chambers reading the announcement over and over, each word a fresh cut. 3 days. They were moving fast, trying to push this through before anyone could object or ask too many questions. She looked at herself in the mirror, saw a woman who looked older than her years, with shadows under her eyes and lines around her mouth that hadn't been there a week ago. Saw someone who'd spent 7 years trying to be perfect, trying to be enough, trying to hold together a marriage that had been broken from the start. And she realized something fundamental had shifted inside her. She didn't want to be that woman anymore. Didn't want to be careful or diplomatic or understanding. Didn't want to swallow her rage and smile and pretend everything was fine. She wanted blood. Maris found her still standing there an hour later. My lady, you need to eat something. Selena turned to face her. How loyal are you? Really? Maris blinked. My lady? If I asked you to do something dangerous, something that could get you exiled or worse, would you do it? The attendant didn't hesitate. Yes. Why? Because you're the only person in this God's forsaken palace who's ever treated me like a human being instead of furniture. And because I'm tired of watching them destroy you. Selena felt something loosen in her chest. One ally. That was something. I need you to get me into the royal archives, the sealed section, tonight. Maris's eyes widened. My lady, that's... The archives are guarded, and the sealed section requires the king's personal seal to access. I know, which is why we're not going through the front door. It took them 2 hours of careful planning and another hour to actually execute. The palace had servant passages running through the walls, hidden corridors that staff used to move unseen. Maris knew them all. They made their way through narrow tunnels that smelled like mold and rat droppings, their path lit by a single candle. Twice they had to freeze and wait while guards passed on the other side of the walls. Once they almost got caught when Selena stumbled and knocked over an old crate, the sound echoing through the passage like thunder. But they made it. The sealed archives were in the basement of the oldest tower, behind a door that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. The lock was ancient but well maintained. Someone came down here. Someone used this room. Maris picked the lock with a bent hairpin and steady hands. Where did you learn to do that? Selena whispered. The attendant smiled grimly. I wasn't always a lady's maid. Inside, the archives were smaller than Selena expected. Just one room lined with shelves, most of them empty. But what was there was carefully organized, each document filed and labeled in neat handwriting. Selena started searching. Birth records, death certificates, marriage contracts, property transfers, everything that made the kingdom function on paper. And then she found it. A leather-bound book tucked in the back corner, almost hidden behind a stack of old tax records. The cover was unmarked, but when she opened it, her breath caught. It was a ledger, a record of payments made from the royal treasury to various individuals over the past 15 years. Hundreds of entries, thousands of gold pieces, all carefully documented, all completely off the books. Her hands shook as she flipped through the pages. She recognized names. Nobles who'd voted with Riker on controversial decisions. Military commanders who'd supported him during succession challenges. Even a few judges who'd ruled in his favor during legal disputes. Riker hadn't just bought loyalty. He'd bought the entire kingdom. And there, near the back, she found the entries for Heir and Blackwater. Regular payments for 3 years. Then nothing. Then a final entry dated the same week as his death. 5,000 gold pieces paid to an individual identified only as K. An assassin, maybe. Or a mercenary. Someone paid to make a problem disappear permanently. "My lady," Maris's voice was tight. "We need to go. Now." Footsteps in the corridor outside. Multiple sets, heavy boots, guards. Selena grabbed the ledger and shoved it inside her dress. They extinguished the candle and waited in the dark, barely breathing. The footsteps passed, kept going, faded into silence. They made it back through the servant passages and into Selena's chambers just as dawn light started filtering through the windows. Both of them were shaking, covered in dust and sweat, adrenaline crashing hard. Selena pulled out the ledger and laid it on her desk like a sacred relic. "This is it," she said softly. "This is everything." Maris stared at the book. "What will you do with it?" Selena smiled, and it was the coldest expression her face had ever worn. "I'm going to destroy them all." The next 2 days passed in a blur of careful planning. Selena made copies of the most damning entries in the ledger, hiding them in different locations throughout the palace. She sent coded messages to 3 nobles she knew had been on the wrong end of Riker's political maneuvering, hinting that she had information they might find interesting. And she waited. The ceremony to present Heir as the royal heir was scheduled for the afternoon of the 3rd day. A full court gathering, all the noble houses in attendance, representatives from allied kingdoms, a spectacle designed to make the boy's legitimacy undeniable. Selena dressed carefully that morning, not in mourning black, though part of her wanted to. Instead, she chose royal blue, the color she'd worn the day she married Riker. Let them see her, let them remember what they were throwing away. Maris helped her with her hair, weaving it into an intricate crown braid. "Your Majesty, are you sure about this?" Selena met her eyes in the mirror. "No. But I'm doing it anyway." The great hall was packed when she arrived. Every seat filled, wolves pressed shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with anticipation and barely concealed gossip. Conversations died as she entered, hundreds of eyes tracking her progress toward the front of the room. Riker was already on the platform, standing beside a small throne that had been brought in specially for Heir. The boy sat there looking terrified, dressed in formal robes that were too big for his narrow shoulders. Lyanna stood behind him, her hand on his shoulder, her face carefully neutral. Elder Morvain occupied the highest seat, looking like an ancient vulture waiting for something to die. Selena took her place on the opposite side of the platform from Riker, close enough to show unity, far enough to make the distance obvious. The ceremony began with the usual prayers and proclamations. Elder Morvain's voice rang through the hall, speaking about bloodlines and destiny, and the sacred responsibility of leadership. The same words Selena had heard at a dozen similar ceremonies. Then came the moment when Heir was supposed to step forward and formally accept his position as heir. The boy stood, his legs shaking, and Selena felt an unexpected pang of something that might have been sympathy. None of this was his fault. He was just a kid caught in a mess made by adults. But sympathy wasn't going to save her. Kindness wasn't going to protect her. Only truth could do that. As Heir opened his mouth to speak the words of acceptance, Selena stood up. The hall went silent. Riker's head whipped toward her, his eyes widening in warning. She ignored him, stepped forward, let her voice carry through the room. "Before this ceremony continues, I have something the court needs to see." Morvain's face went hard as stone. "Queen Selena, you are out of order. Sit down." "No." Selena reached into her dress and pulled out the ledger, holding it up for everyone to see. "This is a record of every illegal payment made from the royal treasury over the past 15 years. Bribes to nobles, payments to military commanders, money paid to silence political opponents, and evidence that at least one murder was committed on the king's orders." The hall erupted, wolves shouting, nobles surging to their feet, chaos spreading like wildfire. Riker's face had gone white. Selina, what are you doing? I'm telling the truth. She looked straight at him. Something you've never had the courage to do. Guards, Morvain barked. Remove her, now. But the guards hesitated, because Commander Dain was standing at the back of the hall, and he hadn't given the order to move. Selina pressed her advantage. You want to legitimize an heir born out of wedlock and deception? Fine. But the kingdom deserves to know what kind of man is asking them to accept this child. The kind of man who pays to have his rivals killed, who buys loyalty instead of earning it, who lies to his own wife for 9 years while she destroys herself trying to give him what he already had. She was shaking now, her voice rising, 7 years of suppressed rage finally breaking free. You want to talk about bloodlines and sacred responsibility? Then let's talk about what Riker Draven has really been doing with this throne. Let's talk about the families he's destroyed, the wolves he's exiled, the corruption that's been rotting this kingdom from the inside out while all of you stood by and did nothing. She threw the ledger at Riker's feet. It landed with a heavy thud that echoed through the stunned silence. There's your legacy, Alpha King. Not strength, not leadership. Just lies and blood money and a child you kept hidden because you were too much of a coward to face the consequences of your own actions. For a long moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then Riker bent down and picked up the ledger, opened it. His face went through a series of expressions: shock, rage, calculation, before settling into something cold and dangerous. When he looked up at Selina, she saw her death in his eyes. You have no idea what you've just done, he said softly. Yes, she said. I do. The silence in the great hall stretched like a bowstring pulled to breaking. Selina stood on the platform with the ledger at Riker's feet, her chest heaving, her hands still trembling from the force of finally saying everything she'd swallowed for 7 years. Every eye in the room was locked on her, on Riker, on the damning book that lay between them like a corpse. Then Elder Morvain laughed. It was a dry, rasping sound that cut through the tension like a blade through silk. The old woman rose from her seat, leaning heavily on her blackwood staff, and that laugh kept coming, growing louder, more contemptuous. "Oh, child," Morvain said, her voice dripping with something that might have been pity, if pity had teeth. "You stupid, stupid child." Selina felt ice crystallize in her stomach. This wasn't the reaction she'd expected. Rage, yes. Denial, absolutely. But not this amused mockery, not this sense that she'd just stepped into a trap she hadn't even known existed. "Did you really think," Morvain continued, moving slowly toward the center of the platform, "that you were the first person to find that ledger? That you stumbled upon some great secret we'd carelessly left lying around?" The ice in Selina's gut spread to her limbs. No, this couldn't be. "That book has been in the sealed archives for 15 years, the elder said, accessible to anyone with the right key, or the right lockpick. She glanced meaningfully at Maris, who stood frozen near the back of the platform, and in all that time, not one person who found it lived long enough to use it against us. Selina's world tilted. She looked at Riker, searching his face for some sign that Morvain was lying, that this was just another power play. But his expression had shifted from shock to something else, something calculating and cold. Understanding hit her like a physical blow. "You knew," she whispered. "You knew I'd find it." Riker picked up the ledger, brushing dust from its cover with almost tender care. "Of course I knew. We've had people watching you since the night of the ceremony. Every room you entered, every document you touched, every conversation you had with your little maid." He looked at Maris then, and Selina saw her attendant's face drain of color. "Did you really think we wouldn't notice you skulking through servant passages at midnight? That we wouldn't hear you picking locks?" He shook his head. "We let you find exactly what we wanted you to find." The hall erupted again, but this time the energy was different. Not shock or outrage, confusion. Nobles looking at each other, trying to figure out what game was being played and which side they should be on. Selina's mind raced, trying to reassemble the pieces of her plan, trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong. The ledger was real. The payments were real. She'd seen the records with her own eyes. Unless that was the point. Oh gods. She'd been so focused on finding evidence against Riker that she hadn't stopped to question why that evidence was so easy to find. "The look on your face right now," Morvain said, almost gently. "That's the moment you realize you've been outmaneuvered. I've seen it 1,000 times. It never gets old. Selena forced herself to speak, though her throat felt like it was closing. The payments are real. The corruption is real. You can't just what? Riker stepped toward her and she instinctively backed away. Admit that yes, I've made strategic payments to ensure loyalty, that I've rewarded those who support the throne. Every king in history has done the same. It's called governance, Selena, not corruption. You had Varen Blackwater killed. I had a traitor dealt with. He took coin from our enemies, plotted to overthrow the kingdom, and got what was coming to him. His voice hardened. And if you'd bothered to read past the dramatic parts, you'd have seen the evidence proving his treachery in that same ledger. She hadn't. She'd been so excited to find ammunition that she'd only focused on the entries that seemed incriminating, hadn't looked at the context, hadn't verified the full story. Amateur mistake, fatal mistake. But the real beauty of this, Morvayn said, is that you did exactly what we needed you to do. You stood up in front of the entire court and accused your husband of crimes. You threw evidence at his feet like a tantrum-throwing child. And now everyone in this kingdom has seen what you really are. What I am? Selena's voice came out hoarse. A bitter, jealous woman who couldn't accept her own inadequacy. The elder's words landed like arrows, each one carefully aimed. A queen who couldn't produce an heir, who blamed everyone but herself for her failures, and who finally snapped when confronted with proof of her own irrelevance. That's exactly how it will be remembered. Morvayn gestured to the assembled court. Look at them, child. Look at their faces. Do you see support? Do you see people rushing to your defense? Selena looked, saw nobles whispering behind their hands, saw eyes sliding away from hers, saw the careful neutrality of wolves who'd already decided which way the wind was blowing. Only Commander Dain met her gaze, and even his expression was conflicted. A soldier caught between duty and something that might have been conscience. The thing about power, Riker said quietly, is that it's not about being right. It's about controlling the narrative. And you just handed us the perfect story. The barren queen, driven mad by jealousy, making wild accusations against the king who only ever tried to protect her. I have copies, Selena said desperately, of the ledger, hidden throughout the palace. Multiple people have seen, have they? Riker's smile was gentle and absolutely merciless. Or did you just think they had? Because every person you contacted, every noble you sent messages to, every wolf you thought might be an ally, they all reported directly to us. The floor seemed to drop out from under her. She thought about the 3 nobles she'd reached out to, the carefully coded messages, the hints about information they might find valuable. All of them had been working for Riker. All of them had been feeding her rope to hang herself with. You set this up, she said, her voice barely audible. From the beginning, the boy at the ceremony, the blood mark, all of it. Riker exchanged a glance with Morvayn. The old woman nodded slightly. Not from the beginning, Riker admitted. Kyle is my son. That part's real. But the timing of the revelation? That was carefully orchestrated. We knew we needed to legitimize him eventually, and we knew you'd be a problem. So we created a situation where you'd destroy yourself trying to destroy me. Why? The word came out broken. Why go through all this? Why not just exile me quietly? Because, Morvayn said, martyrs are dangerous. A queen cast aside for no reason becomes a symbol, a rallying point for discontented wolves. But a queen who reveals herself to be unstable, vindictive, and willing to damage the kingdom out of personal spite, she becomes a cautionary tale. Selena felt something inside her chest crack and crumble. She'd thought she was being smart, thought she was fighting back. Instead, she'd been a puppet, dancing exactly as they'd choreographed. The worst part was that she could see it now, could see how every step of her investigation had been guided. The documents left just slightly too accessible. The timing of Commander Dain's warning, designed to make her feel like she was onto something big. Even Maris! She turned to look at her attendant. Maris stood with her head bowed, tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry, Maris whispered. I'm so sorry. They threatened my family, my sister's children. I didn't have a choice. Everyone has a choice, Morvayn said coldly. She just chose correctly. The cruelty of it settled over Selena like a shroud. Even the one person she'd thought was genuinely on her side had been compromised, used, turned into a weapon against her. She was utterly alone. Riker gestured to the guards. Take her to her chambers. She's to remain there under watch until we decide what to do with her. You can't just imprison me, Selena said, but her voice lacked conviction. Can you? I can do whatever I want. He stepped close enough that only she could hear his next words. You forget, Selena. I'm the king. You're just the woman I married, and that was always a political decision, not a romantic one. The guards moved in. Strong hands on her arms. She didn't resist. What was the point? She'd already lost. As they led her off the platform, she caught sight of Liana standing with Kyle. The woman met Selena's eyes for just a moment, and what Selena saw there wasn't triumph or gloating. It was sympathy, pity. Somehow, that was worse than hatred. The walk back to her chambers felt like a funeral procession. Wolves lined the corridors, watching her pass with expressions ranging from contempt to carefully hidden satisfaction. She kept her head up through sheer force of will, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. But once the door to her rooms closed behind her and she heard the lock click into place, she finally let herself collapse. She ended up on the floor beside her bed, her carefully arranged hair coming loose, her royal blue dress pooling around her like a bruise. She didn't cry. Couldn't cry. The grief was too big for tears, too heavy for any normal expression of pain. She'd gambled everything on one desperate play and lost spectacularly. Hours passed. Maybe days. Time stopped meaning much of anything. Food appeared at intervals brought by guards who wouldn't meet her eyes. She didn't eat, didn't have the appetite or the will. Maris didn't come. Of course she didn't. She'd been reassigned or dismissed or worse, just another casualty of Selena's stupidity. On the third day, or maybe the fourth, she'd lost count, the door opened and Elder Morvain walked in, moving with that slow, deliberate pace of someone who had all the time in the world and knew it. Selena was sitting by the window, still wearing the blue dress because she hadn't had the energy to change. She didn't stand when the elder entered, didn't see the point in pretending at courtesy anymore. Morvain settled into a chair with a sigh. You look terrible, child. Good. Maybe I'll die and save everyone the trouble. Don't be dramatic. The elder pulled out a pipe and began stuffing it with tobacco. We're not going to kill you. That would be counterproductive. Then what are you going to do with me? That depends. Morvain lit her pipe, the smoke curling up toward the ceiling. The council has discussed several options. Exile, permanent house arrest, a quiet disappearance that everyone will understand without needing to be told the details. Selena laughed bitterly. Those all sound like killing me with extra steps. Perhaps. But there is another option, one that requires your cooperation. Selena finally looked at the old woman. Why would I cooperate with any of you? Morvain studied her through the smoke. Because despite everything, you're not stupid. Impulsive, yes. Naive, certainly. But not fundamentally stupid. And I think you're beginning to understand how this game is actually played. What game? Survival. The elder leaned forward slightly. You made a mistake, child. Several mistakes, really. But the biggest one was thinking this was about right and wrong, about justice. It's not. It never has been. It's about power, and who knows how to hold it without cutting themselves on the sharp edges. Selena's voice came out flat, empty. Get to the point. The point is that we have a proposition for you, a way out that lets you keep some dignity and gives us something we need, which is your public support of Kyle's legitimization, a statement to the kingdom that you were mistaken, that your accusations were made in a moment of emotional weakness, and that you fully endorsed the young heir. Selena stared at her. You want me to legitimize my own replacement, to stand up and tell everyone I was wrong. We want you to help us stabilize a transition that could otherwise get very messy. In exchange, you get your estate, your title, and enough wealth to live comfortably for the rest of your life. You disappear quietly, and everyone wins. Except me. You're alive, aren't you? Morvain's voice hardened. Don't underestimate how much worse this could be. I've seen wolves who crossed Riker end up in pieces. Literally, you're being offered a clean exit. I'd suggest taking it. And if I refuse, then we move to one of the less pleasant options. And trust me, child, you don't want that. Selena turned back to the window. Below, she could see the palace gardens, where she'd once walked with Riker in the early days of their marriage. Back when she'd believed in the possibility of love, of partnership, of building something meaningful together. How naive she'd been. How stupid. I need time to think, she said finally. You have until tomorrow morning. Morvain stood, joints cracking. Choose wisely, Selena. This is the only generous offer you're going to get. The elder left, and Selena was alone again with her thoughts and the wreckage of her life. She spent the night pacing her chambers like a caged animal, her mind running through scenarios and options. Every path led to the same place: submission or destruction. Those were her choices. Unless there was always one more option. One play nobody expected because it required a kind of ruthlessness that most people couldn't stomach. Selena had never thought of herself as ruthless. She'd been trained to be gracious, diplomatic, supportive, to stand beside power rather than seize it for herself. But 7 years of marriage to Riker Draven had taught her things, shown her how thrones were really won and kept, how power worked when you stripped away all the pretty lies about honor and duty. If you wanted to survive in a world built on manipulation and betrayal, you had to become something capable of those things, had to change at a fundamental level, shed the skin of who you'd been, and grow something harder underneath. The question was whether she had that in her, whether she could make herself into the kind of person who could play this game and win. She thought about Riker's face when he'd admitted that marrying her had always been a political decision, about Morvain's contemptuous laughter, about all the nobles who'd watched her public humiliation with satisfaction or indifference. She thought about 7 years of pain and shame and fertility treatments that left her body feeling like a battlefield, and she felt something cold and sharp crystallize in her chest, not rage anymore. That had burned out. This was something colder, more calculating. If they wanted her to disappear quietly, that meant she still had value, still had leverage, even if they'd convinced her otherwise. And if she had leverage, she could negotiate. But not from a position of weakness, not as the broken queen begging for mercy. She needed to become someone else entirely. When morning came, Selena sent word that she'd see Elder Morvain. The old woman arrived within the hour, probably expecting capitulation. Selena met her standing, dressed in clean clothes, her hair properly arranged. She'd washed her face, steadied her voice, and buried everything soft deep enough that it wouldn't show. "I've made my decision," she said. "And? I'll make the statement supporting Kael. I'll play the repentant queen who overreacted. I'll give you your clean transition." Morvain's eyes narrowed slightly. "That was easier than expected. But I have conditions." The elder's expression went cold. "You're not in a position to make demands, child." "Yes, I am." Selena kept her voice level. "Because if I go out there and tell everyone I was wrong, I legitimize not just Kael, but the entire story you've built around this. I make it true in a way it isn't yet. You need my cooperation for that, which means I have something you want. Everything you're offering, I could take by force." "You could. But it would look forced. It would raise questions. Why did the queen recant if she was so certain? Why did she suddenly change her story?" People would wonder. And wondering leads to doubt, and doubt leads to instability. Selena took a step toward the elder. "You want this clean. You need me compliant. That gives me leverage." Morvain studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly, she smiled. "There's hope for you yet, child. What are your conditions?" "First, Maris is left alone. Her family is left alone. Whatever threats you made, they end. She was coerced, and I won't see her punished for my mistakes." "Agreed. That's easy enough. What else?" "I want Commander Dain." Morvain's eyebrows rose. "Explain. You're going to exile me." "Fine. But I want Dain and a small contingent of his choosing to come with me as security. Loyal to me, not the throne." The elder was quiet for a long moment. "That's a significant request. The commander is one of our most valuable military assets, and I'm asking for him to babysit an exiled queen. Not exactly a strategic loss." Selena held the old woman's gaze. "Unless you're worried I might actually do something with that protection. In which case, we're back to the question of how confident you are in your position." It was a calculated gamble, asking for something significant enough to have real value, but framing it in a way that made refusing it look like weakness. Morvain considered, then nodded slowly. "I'll discuss it with the council, but I think it can be arranged." "Anything else?" "Yes. When I make my statement, Riker doesn't get to gloat. He stands beside me, and he plays the magnanimous king who forgives his wife's temporary instability. No triumphant speeches, no rubbing salt in the wound. We present a united front one last time, and then I leave with dignity. That will cost you. Name your price. You sign over any claim to royal property beyond what we allocate to your estate. Any jewels, any land grants, any assets acquired during your marriage. It all stays with the throne. Selina pretended to hesitate, like this actually hurt, then nodded. Agreed. Morvain stood. I'll have the papers drawn up. The statement will be tomorrow at midday. Don't make me regret giving you this much rope, child. I won't hang myself with it, if that's what you're worried about. The elder left, and Selina allowed herself one long, slow breath. She'd just negotiated herself a way out that came with military protection and enough resources to start over. It wasn't revenge, it wasn't justice, but it was survival. And sometimes, survival was enough. The next day, the Great Hall was packed again. Selina stood on the platform in a simple gray dress, her hair loose, looking properly humbled. Riker stood beside her in full royal regalia, the picture of masculine authority. The assembled court was hungry for this moment. The final defeat of the Baron Queen, the official validation of everything they'd whispered about her for years. Selina let them wait, let the anticipation build, before she finally spoke. I stand before you today to address the accusations I made in this very hall 3 days ago. Accusations that were born from pain and jealousy rather than truth. Her voice was steady, pitched to carry. I allowed my personal feelings to cloud my judgment, and in doing so, I damaged the very institution I swore to protect. She could feel Riker beside her, probably barely suppressing a smile. I was wrong about my husband, wrong about the council, and most importantly, wrong to put my own wounded pride above the stability of this kingdom. She turned to look at Kael, who stood near the throne, looking nervous. This child is the rightful heir to the Shadow Peak throne. He carries the blood mark. He carries the legacy. And he deserves the support of every wolf in this realm, including mine. The crowd murmured, the sound washing over her like waves. I ask your forgiveness for my actions, and I ask that you judge me not by this moment of weakness, but by the 7 years I spent serving this kingdom with everything I had. She looked at Riker then, and for just a moment let him see the cold calculation in her eyes. Let him see that she knew exactly what she was doing and why. Then she bowed her head and stepped back. The hall erupted in applause, nobles pleased to have their worldview confirmed. The unstable woman put back in her place. Order restored. Riker stepped forward, playing his part perfectly. My wife has shown great courage in admitting her mistakes. I harbor no ill will toward her, and I hope the kingdom can find it in their hearts to offer the same grace. She has served faithfully, and she will always have my respect, even as we pursue separate paths forward. Beautiful performance. Carefully scripted by Morvain, no doubt. But as Selina walked off the platform for the last time, she felt something unfamiliar settle into her bones. Not defeat, not resignation, purpose. She'd spent 7 years trying to be the perfect queen, trying to fit herself into a role that was never meant for her, trying to earn love that had never been on offer. She was done trying. Commander Dain was waiting outside the hall, along with 6 of his most trusted warriors, all of them wearing travel gear instead of ceremonial armor. "Ready, Your Majesty?" he asked quietly. "Don't call me that anymore." She looked at the palace one last time, memorizing the shape of it. Selina is fine. They rode out that afternoon, a small caravan heading toward the Western Territories where her new estate waited. As the palace disappeared behind them, Selina reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a small leather notebook. Inside were names, real names this time, gathered carefully over her last 3 days of captivity. Wolves who'd been wronged by Riker's reign, clans who'd lost land or status, exiled nobles nursing grudges, everyone who had reason to want the current system torn down and rebuilt. Commander Dain rode up beside her. "What's that?" "Insurance." She closed the notebook. "In case I ever decide quiet retirement isn't really my style." He was silent for a moment. Then, "You're planning something." "Not yet. Maybe not ever." She looked at the horizon, at the vast open territory spreading before them. But it's good to have options. They rode in silence after that, and Selina felt the weight of 7 years begin to lift from her shoulders. She'd lost the throne, lost her title, lost the man she'd once believed she loved. But she'd gained something infinitely more valuable. She'd learned exactly how power worked, how thrones were taken and kept, how to be ruthless when ruthlessness was required. And most importantly, she'd learned that she was capable of becoming someone entirely new, someone harder, someone dangerous. The question now was whether she'd use that knowledge. Time would tell. 6 months of exile had changed Selena Voss in ways that went deeper than skin. The estate Riker had granted her sat on the western edge of the kingdom, far enough from court politics to be forgotten, but close enough to the border territories that she could watch the smaller clans struggle under the weight of royal taxation and corruption. She'd spent those months listening more than talking, observing how power moved through the outer regions like poison through veins. Commander Dain had stayed true to his word. He and his 6 warriors formed the core of what was slowly becoming something more than just a security detail. Word spread among the disaffected wolves that the exiled queen offered sanctuary, and slowly, carefully, they came. Soldiers who'd been discharged for questioning orders, nobles whose lands had been seized, families torn apart by laws designed to consolidate power in Riker's hands. Selena hadn't planned to build an army, but somehow that's what was happening. She stood now in the training yard behind the main house, watching 2 young wolves spar with wooden practice swords. The autumn air bit cold enough to see breath, and her own exhaled in steady clouds as she studied their technique. One was too aggressive, leaving his guard open. The other too defensive, never pressing advantage when it appeared. Both would get themselves killed in real combat. Both needed work. "Your form's garbage," she called out. The aggressive one dropped his guard to look at her, and his opponent immediately landed a hit to his ribs. "See? Dead. That's what happens when you lose focus." The young wolf grimaced, rubbing his side. "Sorry, my lady. Don't apologize. Fix it." She moved closer, adjusting his stance with quick, efficient movements. Commander Dain had been teaching her practical combat over the past months, and her body had responded with surprising readiness. 7 years of fertility treatments had left her weaker than she'd realized, but 6 months of decent food and hard training had rebuilt something she'd forgotten she had. Strength, real strength, not the performative kind required at court. A horn sounded from the front of the estate. 3 short blasts. Visitors. Selena's hand went automatically to the blade at her hip. She wore one now, always. Had learned the hard way that being unarmed was the same as being helpless, and she was done with helpless. Dain appeared from the stables, moving with that efficient soldier's economy that wasted no motion. 2 riders approaching, flying neutral colors. Neutral meant they weren't from Riker. Could be merchants, could be scouts, could be trouble wearing a friendly face. "I'll meet them," Selena said. "Keep the men ready just in case." She walked to the front gate, her boots crunching on gravel, her breath steady despite the spike of adrenaline. The past months had taught her that danger rarely announced itself with trumpets and war cries. It usually came wearing a smile and carrying reasonable words. The riders were already dismounting when she reached the gate. 2 women, both carrying themselves like wolves who knew how to fight. The older one had gray streaking through her dark hair and scars that suggested a long history of surviving things that should have killed her. The younger looked barely 20, with sharp eyes that took in everything and calculated threats with visible precision. The older woman stepped forward. "You're Selena Voss." "I am. State your business." "My name is Kara Nightshade. This is my daughter Vex. We've come a long way to talk to you." The name registered immediately. Nightshade. One of the northern clans that had been stripped of their holdings 4 years ago after refusing to pay increased tribute. They'd scattered into the wilderness, becoming raiders and guerrilla fighters rather than submit. Dangerous wolves, desperate wolves, exactly the kind of wolves Selena had been quietly gathering. "Come inside," she said. "We'll talk." She led them to a small meeting room where maps covered most of one wall, marked with notes and symbols that tracked troop movements, tax collection routes, and the locations of royal outposts. It was the kind of information that would get her executed if Riker ever saw it, but secrecy didn't matter much anymore. Either she'd use this intelligence to do something meaningful, or she'd die trying. The middle ground had disappeared the moment she'd ridden away from the palace. Kara studied the maps with obvious interest. "You've been busy. Knowledge is power when you don't have armies." Selena poured water for all of them, keeping her movements casual despite the tension thrumming through her shoulders. "What brings the Nightshade clan to my door?" "Word travels." Kara accepted the water, but didn't drink. Word says the exiled queen isn't as broken as the royal court wants everyone to believe. Word says she's gathering wolves who have scores to settle. Word talks a lot. Does it lie? Selena met the older woman's eyes. That depends on what exactly Word is saying. Vex spoke up, her voice carrying an edge that suggested she had no patience for verbal dancing. Word says you're planning something against Riker Draven. Word says you want revenge for what he did to you. I want a lot of things. Selena sat down, forcing her body to relax into the chair, even though every instinct said to stay ready to move. Revenge is just one item on a long list. We're not interested in your list. Kara leaned forward. We're interested in whether you have the spine to actually do something, or if you're just playing at rebellion while living comfortably in exile. The bluntness was almost refreshing after months of careful political language. Selena found herself smiling, cold and sharp. What would convince you I have spine? Action. Kara pulled a folded paper from her coat and spread it on the table. 3 weeks from today, there's a blood moon gathering at the palace. Every major house will be there. Every elder, every commander. The entire power structure of this kingdom gathered in one place. I'm aware. Selena had been tracking the event since word of it reached her 2 months ago. The Blood Moon Gathering happened once every 5 years, a massive ceremony where alliances were renewed and disputes were formally settled. It was theater and politics wrapped in tradition. It was also the perfect moment for someone to make a statement that couldn't be ignored. We have information, Vex said, her fingers tracing lines on the map, that Riker is planning to use the gathering to announce new territorial divisions. He's carving up the northern and western regions, giving the best lands to nobles who've supported him and pushing the rest of us further into the margins. Consolidating power, Selena said quietly, making sure any potential resistance is too scattered and resource-poor to mount a real challenge. Exactly. Kara's voice went hard. And once those divisions are formalized and witnessed by the entire kingdom, they become permanent. We lose any legal claim to our ancestral lands. We become outlaws instead of dispossessed nobles. So you want me to do what? Stand up at the gathering and object? She let skepticism color her words. You saw what happened last time I tried public confrontation. I got played like a child. Last time you were alone and unprepared. Vex's eyes glittered. This time you'd have allies, real ones, us, and others we've been talking to. How many others? Enough to make noise, enough to force the council to listen. Kara stood, pacing to the window, but only if we have someone who can speak with authority. Someone the kingdom can't just dismiss as a rogue clan with a grudge. Someone like the former queen. There it was, the real reason for this visit. They needed legitimacy, and Selena was the only wolf outside the palace who could provide it. She studied the two women carefully, weighing risks against potential rewards. Everything inside her that had been trained for court politics screamed that this was dangerous, that getting involved with armed resistance would paint a target on her back that even Commander Diane couldn't protect her from. But that voice had gotten quieter over the past months, replaced by something harder that understood a fundamental truth. Safety and significance couldn't coexist. You either stayed small and unnoticed, or you took risks that might kill you. There was no middle path for wolves who'd already been marked as threats. What exactly are you proposing? She asked. Kara turned back from the window. We interrupt the gathering. Present evidence of Riker's corruption that can't be dismissed or explained away. Force the council to address the rot at the heart of this kingdom. I tried that already, remember? With the ledger? They turned it against me. Because you played by their rules. Vex's smile was feral. This time we don't ask permission. We don't wait for an appropriate moment. We crash the ceremony with enough armed wolves that they have to listen. And we make sure everyone in that hall understands that submission isn't the only option anymore. You're talking about a coup, Selena said flatly. We're talking about justice, Kara corrected. Call it what you want, but this kingdom is dying from the inside. Riker and his council are bleeding the outer territories dry to maintain their luxury, and eventually there won't be anything left but a hollow shell with a crown on top. The words resonated with something Selena had been observing over her months of exile. The stories refugees brought to her gates. Children going hungry because their parents' entire harvest went to royal taxes. Elders dying without medicine because the healers all served the palace now. Communities fracturing under the weight of laws designed to punish rather than govern. She'd spent 7 years at the center of power thinking she was helping to run a kingdom. Turned out she'd been helping to run a sophisticated extortion operation. The realization still tasted like ash. Even if we succeed in disrupting the gathering, she said slowly, what then? You think exposing corruption will suddenly make Riker step down? Make the council reform? She shook her head. They'll just crush us. They have the Royal Guard, the elite forces, resources we can't match. Not if we break their authority first. Kara's voice dropped. That's the real weapon here, Selena. Not swords or soldiers. Authority. Right now, Riker rules because everyone believes he has the right to rule. Because the bloodline says so. Because tradition says so. Because the Elder Council validates him. But if enough wolves stop believing, Vex continued, if enough of the kingdom sees proof that he's broken every law he's supposed to uphold, then his authority cracks. And once it cracks, it shatters. It was a gamble that made Selena's calculated risks back at the palace look like children's games. This wasn't about smart maneuvering or finding leverage. This was about open defiance backed by the implicit threat of violence. And if it failed, everyone involved would die badly. But if it succeeded, they might actually change something. She thought about Maris, coerced into betrayal to protect her family. About Commander Dain, who'd served honorably for decades and watched his king become a tyrant. About all the wolves living in the shadow of a throne that took and gave back nothing but fear. She thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago, standing in that palace, convinced that her small acts of obedience somehow made her complicit in something righteous. That woman was dead. Had died the moment Riker admitted their marriage had always been political convenience wrapped in pretty words. The woman sitting here now understood that sometimes the only moral choice was the dangerous one. That real change required risks that comfortable people would never take. She met Kara's eyes and saw her own determination reflected back. I'm in, Selena said. Tell me what you need. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of planning and preparation. Kara's network was more extensive than Selena had imagined. Dispossessed nobles, discharged soldiers, entire clans living in forced diaspora. They all came together under a single unifying purpose: make the gathering impossible to ignore. Selena's role was clear. She'd be the voice, the former queen who could command attention even if she no longer commanded respect. The others would provide the muscle and the evidence. And they had evidence. Real evidence this time, not the trap she'd walked into before. Financial records smuggled out by a palace accountant who'd grown disgusted with what she was documenting. Testimonies from wolves who'd lost everything to royal land seizures. Letters in Riker's own hand ordering actions that violated kingdom law. It was damning, undeniable, and it had teeth because Selena wasn't going to present it to the council in private. She was going to present it to everyone. Commander Dain pulled her aside 2 days before the gathering. You understand this is likely a death sentence. She was sharpening her blade, the rhythmic scrape of whetstone on steel almost meditative. I understand, and you're doing it anyway. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. May I ask why? She tested the blade's edge with her thumb, watching a thin line of blood well up. Because I spent 7 years being safe, being obedient, playing by rules designed to keep me powerless. And at the end of it all, I was still destroyed, still humiliated, still cast aside. So you're choosing to be destroyed on your own terms instead of theirs. She looked up at him. I'm choosing to mean something, even if it kills me, even if it fails. At least I'll die standing up instead of kneeling. Dain nodded slowly. Then I'll stand with you, and fall with you if it comes to that. I can't ask you to... You're not asking. I'm choosing. There's a difference. The night before the gathering, Selena couldn't sleep. She stood on the balcony of her chambers watching the moon rise, full and blood-red like the ceremony's name. Blood Moon. Appropriate for what was coming. Behind her, Vex appeared in the doorway. Everything's ready. The clans are positioned. We move at dawn. Selena didn't turn around. Do you think we have a chance? A chance at what? Surviving? Maybe. Succeeding? I don't know. The younger woman came to stand beside her. But I know what happens if we don't try. More years of slow death. More watching my people scatter and break. More pretending that obedience will eventually earn us mercy. Selena glanced at her. You're young to be this cynical. I'm young because my parents didn't survive being hopeful. Vex's voice carried a bitterness that aged her beyond her years. Hope without action is just slower suicide. They rode out at dawn, a force of nearly 200 wolves moving through the gray morning light toward the palace. Not an army, not yet, but not helpless either. They were armed, trained, and desperate enough to be dangerous. The palace guards saw them coming when they were still a mile out. Horns sounded. Gates began closing. But Selena's group didn't approach the main entrance. They headed for the ceremony grounds behind the palace, the open amphitheater where the blood moon gathering would take place. By the time the royal guard mobilized to intercept them, Selena and her wolves were already spreading through the crowd of assembled nobles. Not attacking, not threatening, just present, visible, impossible to remove without causing the kind of chaos that would destroy the ceremony's carefully orchestrated dignity. Riker appeared on the central platform, flanked by Elder Morvain and the full council. His face went through a series of expressions when he saw Selena: shock, anger, calculation, before settling into cold fury. "Selena," he called out, his voice amplified to carry across the grounds. "You were exiled. This is a violation of the terms of your release." She stepped forward, feeling hundreds of eyes lock onto her. Sensing the weight of this moment, understanding that there was no turning back now. Every step from here led either to transformation or destruction, and she'd accepted both possibilities during those sleepless hours before dawn. "I was exiled," she agreed, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "But I was never stripped of my right to petition the council during a gathering. Ancient law, available to any wolf with legitimate grievance." She saw Morvain's eyes narrow, saw the old woman recognize the trap. If they denied Selena's right to speak, they'd be violating tradition in front of the entire kingdom. But if they allowed it, they'd be giving her a platform. The elder stood slowly. "State your grievance, then, quickly." "My grievance," Selena said, "is that this kingdom has been built on corruption and maintained through violence against its own people, and I have evidence to prove it." She gestured, and Kara stepped forward carrying a wooden case. Inside were the documents they'd gathered, the proof they'd assembled, the ammunition for this confrontation. Over the next hour, Selena methodically laid out the case against Riker and his council, spoke clearly and without emotion, letting the facts carry their own weight. Financial records showing systematic theft from royal coffers, letters ordering land seizures that violated inheritance law, testimonies from wolves who'd watched their families destroyed for refusing to participate in schemes that enriched the crown. She didn't editorialize, didn't rage, just presented information and let the assembled nobles draw their own conclusions. The crowd grew restless. Whispers became conversations, became arguments. Wolves who'd benefited from Riker's reign shouted her down. Wolves who'd suffered under it shouted agreement. The careful order of the ceremony dissolved into chaos. Riker finally stood, his face dark with rage. "Enough. This is a coordinated attack by exiled criminals and traitors. Their so-called evidence is fabricated, designed to undermine the legitimate authority of—" "Then explain this," Selena interrupted, pulling out the final document. "A letter in your own hand ordering the execution of the Blackwater family. Not exile, not arrest, execution, including children." She held it up for everyone to see. The crowd went silent. "Those children were threats to the throne," Riker said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. The Blackwater patriarch had committed treason. His entire bloodline was murdered for having a better claim than yours. She turned to address the crowd directly. "How many of you have watched families disappear? How many have seen land seized, rights revoked, wolves exiled for questioning royal authority? This isn't governance. This is tyranny." "You're calling for rebellion," Morvain accused. "Trying to destroy the stability of this kingdom because your pride was wounded. I'm calling for accountability." Selena's voice rose. "I'm saying that no wolf, not even an alpha king, is above the law, and if you won't hold him accountable, then maybe we need a system that will." The crowd erupted. Nobles shouting, guards moving to surround the platform. Selena's wolves pressing forward, hands on weapons but not drawing them. Yet, Riker descended from the platform, moving toward Selena with predatory grace. "You think you can tear down what I've built? You think these scattered malcontents can challenge the throne?" He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his winter storm eyes. Close enough to smell the anger on him. "I loved you once," he said quietly, "just for her. I would have given you everything if you'd been patient, if you'd understood your place. My place, Selena said, matching his volume, was supposed to be beside you, as a partner. Instead, you made me a prisoner and called it marriage. Then you should have been smarter about escape. He turned to address his guards. Arrest her. Arrest everyone who came with her. The charge is treason. The guards moved forward, but Commander Dain and his warriors stepped between them and Selena. Weapons came out on both sides. The ceremony grounds transformed into an armed standoff in seconds. This is your last chance to stand down, Riker said, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. Surrender now, and I'll make it quick. Selena looked at the guards surrounding them, at the nobles watching with expressions ranging from fear to hunger, at Riker standing there like the embodiment of authority that couldn't be questioned. And she realized something fundamental. He'd already lost, not the fight. The fight might still go against her, but he'd lost the thing that mattered most, the absolute certainty of his own legitimacy. She could see it in the way he stood, the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept flicking to the crowd looking for validation. He needed them to believe. And for the first time, some of them weren't sure. That uncertainty was a crack in the foundation. And cracks could become chasms if you knew where to strike. I'm not surrendering, she said clearly. And neither are any of the wolves standing with me. You want to arrest us? Kill us? Fine. But do it in front of everyone. Let the kingdom watch you murder wolves for demanding accountability. Let them see what your authority really looks like when it's challenged. She spread her arms wide, weaponless, exposed. Go ahead, Riker. Show them who you really are. The moment stretched like a blade pressed against skin. Riker's hand hovered near his weapon. The guards waited for the order. The crowd held its collective breath. And then, from the back of the amphitheater, a voice rang out. The Queen speaks truth. Selena's heart hammered. She couldn't see who'd shouted, but it didn't matter, because a moment later another voice joined it. Show us the evidence. Then another, and another. Wolves who'd been silent for years suddenly finding their voices. Not a majority, not even close, but enough to break the illusion of unanimous support. Enough to turn this from a simple arrest into something more complicated. Riker's face twisted with rage. He drew his blade, the steel singing as it cleared the scabbard, and every wolf on that field went tense. You want accountability? He snarled. I'll show you what happens to wolves who forget their place. He lunged at Selena, fast and brutal, and she barely got her own blade up in time to deflect the strike. Metal screamed against metal. The force of it drove her back 3 steps. And then the ceremony grounds exploded into violence. The ceremony grounds became a battlefield in the space between heartbeats. Steel rang against steel. Wolves collided in brutal combat, and the carefully orchestrated dignity of the Blood Moon gathering shattered into violence that would define the kingdom for generations. Selena fought like something feral and desperate, deflecting Riker's strikes with technique Commander Dain had drilled into her over months of relentless training. But technique only carried you so far against a wolf who'd been bred for combat since birth, whose every movement carried the weight of absolute certainty in his own supremacy. Riker was stronger, faster, and fighting with the kind of rage that made men careless and terrifying in equal measure. His blade came at her in a horizontal arc meant to disembowel, and she barely twisted away in time, feeling the wind of its passage against her stomach. Her counterstrike caught nothing but air as he flowed backward with predatory grace. You should have stayed exiled, he snarled, circling her like a wolf cornering prey. Should have taken your comfortable retirement and lived out your days in obscurity. And you should have been honest, she shot back, her breathing already labored. Should have had the courage to tell me the truth instead of building your kingdom on lies. Around them, the battle raged without clear lines or easy allegiances. Some of the royal guard had turned on their brothers, unwilling to kill wolves demanding nothing more than accountability. Some nobles fought to protect Riker's authority, while others stood frozen, trying to decide which side would leave them alive when the dust settled. Commander Dain and his warriors formed a protective circle around Selena's position, holding back guards who tried to overwhelm her while she faced their king. It was chaos, pure and absolute. The kind of moment where civilization's thin veneer burned away and left only the raw mathematics of survival. Riker lunged again, faster this time, and his blade slipped past her guard to open a line of fire across her ribs. She gasped, stumbling back, blood soaking into her shirt, warm and immediate. The pain came a second later, sharp enough to steal her breath. He pressed his advantage, driving her backward with a combination of strikes she could barely track. Her blade moved on instinct now, muscle memory the only thing keeping her alive as exhaustion and injury started dragging at her limbs. "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" Riker's voice carried an edge of something that might have been genuine anguish beneath the rage. "You wanted to matter, to be remembered. Well, congratulations, Selena. You'll be remembered as the queen who started a civil war. Better than being forgotten as the queen who enabled a tyrant." She caught his next strike on the flat of her blade and twisted hard, using his own momentum to throw him off balance. It gave her 3 seconds of breathing room, 3 seconds to assess the broader battlefield. What she saw wasn't encouraging. Her wolves were fighting hard, but they were outnumbered. The Royal Guard was well-trained and disciplined, even in chaos. Bodies already littered the ground, blood soaking into earth that was supposed to be sacred ceremonial space. They were losing. The realization settled into her bones with crystalline clarity. They'd made their stand, exposed the corruption, forced the kingdom to witness the violence required to maintain Riker's authority. But witness wasn't the same as victory. Most of the nobles were still watching from the safety of the amphitheater's edges, content to let others bleed while they waited to see which power structure would emerge intact. Cowards. All of them. Comfortable wolves who preferred known tyranny to the uncertainty of change. But perhaps that was simply how power worked. Perhaps real transformation only came when comfortable wolves found themselves as uncomfortable as everyone else, when the violence they'd outsourced finally arrived at their own doorsteps. Riker recovered his balance and came at her again, relentless as a storm. She met him blade to blade, feeling her arms shake with each impact, knowing she couldn't sustain this much longer. Blood loss and exhaustion were pulling at her like hands dragging her underwater. Around them, the fighting intensified. Elder Morvain's voice cut through the chaos, calling for the Royal Guard to crush the rebellion, to restore order through overwhelming force. Several commanders responded, pulling their warriors into coordinated formations that began systematically dismantling the scattered resistance. Kara went down under 3 guards, her blade knocked from her hand, blood streaming from a cut above her eye. Vex screamed and threw herself at her mother's attackers with abandon, buying the older woman time to crawl away but taking a vicious strike to the shoulder that spun her around and dropped her to one knee. They were all going to die here. Selena could see it playing out like scenes from a tragedy already written. Her wolves would fight until they couldn't anymore, and then they'd be executed as traitors, and the kingdom would go back to exactly what it had been before. Maybe worse, as Riker tightened his grip to prevent any future challenges. 7 years of marriage, 6 months of planning, and it was all going to end in pointless slaughter on ceremonial grounds while nobles watched and calculated their own survival. The injustice of it burned hotter than the wound in her side. Riker's next strike came in low, aiming for her leg, trying to cripple rather than kill. She deflected but not cleanly, and the blade scored across her thigh deep enough to make her cry out. Her leg buckled. She went down on one knee, blade raised to block the killing blow she knew was coming. "It's over," Riker said, standing above her with his sword raised. "You fought well. For what it's worth, I'm sorry it came to this." She looked up at him through sweat and blood and exhaustion, seeing the man she'd once believed she loved, recognizing now that she'd never actually known him at all. Had only known the version he'd chosen to show her, the careful performance designed to secure her cooperation. The real Riker Draven was this: a wolf who'd kill rather than be questioned, who'd destroy rather than change. "I'm not," she said quietly. His sword started to descend, and then Commander Dain hit him from the side like a battering ram, both of them going down in a tangle of limbs and steel. The commander was bleeding from a dozen wounds, his gray hair matted with blood, but his eyes were clear and focused as he grappled with his former king. "Run!" he shouted at Selena. "Get out of here while you can." But she couldn't run. Couldn't stand, actually, her wounded leg refusing to support her weight. She could only watch as Dain and Riker fought with the brutal efficiency of 2 warriors who'd trained together for decades and knew each other's every move. They rolled apart, both coming up armed, circled each other while the battle raged around them. "You're making a mistake, Dain," Riker said, his voice carrying genuine pain. "We're brothers. We've fought side by side for 20 years, and I've watched you become something I don't recognize." The commander's blade never wavered. Someone had to say no eventually. Might as well be me. They clashed again, and Selena saw immediately that Dain was outmatched. He was older, wounded, fighting a king in his prime. But he fought anyway, trading his life for time, giving Selena's wolves precious seconds to regroup or retreat. That was what real strength looked like, she realized. Not the performance of dominance, not the cultivation of power, but the willingness to stand between tyranny and its victims even when you knew you'd lose. Especially when you knew you'd lose, because that's when the choice meant something. Riker's blade found Dain's stomach, punching through leather and flesh with brutal finality. The commander gasped, his sword dropping from suddenly nerveless fingers. Riker held him there for a moment, impaled, their faces inches apart. "I'm sorry," Riker said, and it sounded genuine. "You were a good soldier." Dain coughed blood. "I was a better man." Riker withdrew his blade and the commander collapsed, hitting the ground hard and not moving again. Something inside Selena broke at the sight. Not broke like shattering. Broke like a dam giving way, releasing something that had been building pressure for too long. She felt it flood through her, hot and fierce and absolutely clear. She wasn't going to die here. Wasn't going to let Dain's sacrifice mean nothing. Wasn't going to give Riker the satisfaction of ending this on his terms. She forced herself to stand, putting weight on her wounded leg despite the screaming agony, blade raised in trembling hands. Around her, the battle was winding down. Her wolves were surrounded, disarmed, being forced to their knees by guards who'd maintained formation and discipline throughout the chaos. Riker turned from Dain's corpse to face her, his blade still dripping blood. His expression was unreadable, somewhere between triumph and exhaustion, and something that might have been regret. "It didn't have to be like this," he said. "Yes, it did." Her voice came out steady despite the pain. "This is who you are. Who you've always been. I just didn't see it until you forced me to look." She stepped toward him, limping, leaving bloody footprints on ground already soaked with violence. Every movement hurt, but she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Because stopping meant accepting that power would always win, that wolves like Riker could destroy everything they touched and never face consequences. He raised his blade. "Selena, don't make me—" "Make you what? Kill me in front of everyone?" "Go ahead. Add my corpse to the pile. Let the kingdom see exactly what you'll do to maintain control." She spread her arms, defenseless, blade hanging loose in one hand, offering him the same choice she'd offered before. Kill her and prove her point, or let her live and admit weakness. Riker stood frozen, caught between impulses. His eyes flicked to the assembled nobles, to Elder Morvain watching from the platform, to the guards holding Selena's captured wolves. And in that moment of hesitation, Selena saw something she hadn't expected. Fear. Not of her. Not of her blade or her allies, but fear of what killing her here would mean. Fear of crossing some line that even he recognized as fundamental. Because murdering an unarmed woman in cold blood during a sacred ceremony was different than executing traitors. It was the kind of act that stripped away any pretense of legitimacy, that revealed tyranny for what it actually was. He was afraid that if he killed her now, he'd lose something he couldn't get back. The moment stretched between them like glass pulled to transparency. Selena could hear her own heartbeat, could feel blood running down her leg, could taste copper and exhaustion and something that might have been victory or might have been despair. Then a voice cut through the silence. "Enough!" Elder Morvain descended from the platform, moving with surprising speed for someone her age. She placed herself between Selena and Riker, her blackwood staff planted firmly on blood-soaked ground. "This has gone far enough," the elder said. "More than far enough." "Stand aside, Morvain," Riker growled. "This isn't your fight. Everything that happens in this kingdom is my fight." The old woman's voice carried absolute authority. "I've served 5 kings, watched this realm grow from scattered clans into something that almost resembled civilization. And I'll be damned if I let you tear it apart, because you can't handle criticism." "She's committed treason," Riker said, but his voice lacked the certainty it had carried before. "She's demanded accountability. There's a difference." Morvain turned to face the assembled nobles, her voice rising to carry across the grounds. "All of you, look at what we've become. Look at what we're doing to each other. Is this the kingdom we want? One where questions are met with violence, where loyalty is purchased and dissent is crushed?" The nobles shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away. Others met the elder's gaze with expressions that suggested they'd been asking themselves the same questions. We have a choice, Morvain continued. We can end this now, acknowledge the legitimate grievances that sparked this violence, and begin the work of actual reform. Or we can slaughter everyone who challenged us today and guarantee that this happens again in 5 years or 10, but worse. She turned back to Riker. You're my king. I've supported you through challenges that would have broken lesser wolves. But today you've shown me something I can't ignore. You've shown me a man so afraid of losing power that he's willing to destroy the kingdom to keep it. That's not true, Riker said, but the words came out weak. Then prove it. Put down your blade. Acknowledge what the evidence shows. Take responsibility for the corruption that's been poisoning this realm. She leaned on her staff. Show the kingdom that strength means more than the ability to kill. The silence that followed was absolute. Every eye on the grounds focused on Riker, waiting to see what the Alpha King would do when confronted with a choice between adaptation and annihilation. Selena watched him wrestle with it, saw the calculation in his eyes as he weighed options and outcomes. This was who he'd always been, she realized. Not evil, not intentionally cruel, but so consumed by the mechanics of maintaining power that he'd forgotten what power was supposed to serve. He'd built a throne on fear and called it strength, had created loyalty through coercion and called it respect, had surrounded himself with wolves who'd tell him what he wanted to hear and called it wisdom. And now, faced with the wreckage of that approach, he had to choose whether to double down or admit that maybe, possibly, he'd been wrong. Riker's blade lowered slowly. Not dropped, but lowered. The gesture of a wolf who hadn't surrendered but who'd stopped actively trying to kill. What would you have me do? He asked, and his voice carried a note Selena had never heard before. Genuine uncertainty. Morvain stepped back, gesturing to the carnage surrounding them. First, stop the slaughter. Order your guards to stand down. Let the healers tend to the wounded regardless of which side they fought for. Riker hesitated, then nodded. He raised his voice, projecting across the grounds. All forces, cease combat. Guards, stand down and secure the perimeter. Get healers to anyone who needs them. The fighting stopped raggedly, wolves disengaging with visible reluctance, adrenaline still singing in their veins, demanding violence that was no longer sanctioned. Healers emerged from where they'd been sheltering, moving among the wounded with the efficient detachment of those who'd seen too much blood to be shocked by more. Second, Morvain continued, you will address the evidence that's been presented. Not dismiss it, not explain it away. Actually address the corruption and abuse of power that these wolves risk their lives to expose. Riker looked at Selena, his expression complicated. The evidence is real? Most of it. She forced herself to stand straight despite the pain. Some is probably exaggerated. Some is interpretation. But the core of it? The systematic exploitation of outer territories? The use of royal authority to crush legitimate opposition? That's all true. And you know it. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, reluctantly, yes, I know it. The admission rippled through the assembled nobles like wind through grass. Several looked shocked. Others looked vindicated. A few looked angry that the comfortable fiction they'd been living under had just been stripped away. Third, Morvain said, there will be consequences. Not execution, not exile, but genuine reforms. A council with real oversight power, laws limiting royal authority, restoration of lands that were seized illegally. The old woman's eyes were hard as stone. You wanted to be remembered as a great king, Riker. Here's your chance. Be great enough to admit your failures and fix them. And if I refuse, then I will personally lead the council in removing you from the throne. Morvain's voice left no room for doubt. I'm too old to watch this kingdom tear itself apart because one wolf couldn't learn when to bend. It was, Selena realized, the closest thing to a coup that could be executed without calling it one. Morvain was offering Riker a way to keep his crown, but only if he transformed what that crown meant. Only if he surrendered the absolute authority he'd fought so hard to maintain. She watched him wrestle with it, saw the moment he understood that his real choice wasn't between victory and defeat. It was between controlled transformation or chaotic collapse. Either he changed on his terms, or change would be forced upon him. He looked at Selena one more time, and she saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Not love, probably not even respect, but maybe a kind of recognition, an acknowledgement that she'd pushed him to this moment, forced him to confront what he'd become. I'll agree to reforms. he said finally. But I want representatives from all territories involved in designing them. This can't be just the council deciding what's best for everyone. Morvain nodded slowly. Acceptable. And Selena gets a seat at that table. Riker's voice was firm. She earned it. Whether I like it or not. The old woman looked at Selena, one eyebrow raised in question. Selena wanted to refuse, wanted to spit in his face and walk away from everything to do with this kingdom and its poisonous politics. But she thought about Kara and Vex and all the other wolves who'd fought today, thought about the refugees who'd come to her gates with stories of suffering, thought about Commander Diane bleeding out on ceremonial grounds because someone needed to say no. If she walked away now, his death meant nothing. All of this meant nothing. I'll accept a seat, she said, but I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for everyone you hurt while building your empire. Riker nodded. That's fair. The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Healers worked frantically to save those who could be saved. Bodies were collected and counted. The cost of the day's violence tallied in blood and broken families. 37 dead by the time the count finished, 56 wounded seriously enough to need ongoing care. Numbers that would haunt Selena for the rest of her life because she'd been the one who'd sparked this confrontation. She sat in a healer's tent while a young wolf named Marina stitched the wound in her side with careful precision. The injury to her leg was less serious, already bandaged and treated with herbs that dulled the worst of the pain. You should rest, Marina said, tying off the last stitch. You've lost a lot of blood. Later. Selena stood carefully, testing her weight on the injured leg. There's work to do first. She found Kara and Vex in another tent, both bandaged and bruised but alive. The older woman looked up when Selena entered, her scarred face unreadable. Did we win? Kara asked. Selena considered the question. They'd stopped the immediate violence, forced Riker to acknowledge his corruption, secured promises of reform. But 37 wolves were dead, and the kingdom was fracturing along new fault lines. We survived, she said finally. Whether that counts as winning depends on what happens next. Vex winced as a healer adjusted the bandage on her shoulder. What does happen next? We rebuild. We reform. We try to create something better than what we had. Selena sat down carefully, her stitches pulling. Or we fail and tear ourselves apart. Honestly, I don't know which is more likely. The younger woman laughed bitterly. At least we'll fail on our own terms. There was truth in that, Selena thought. Whatever came next, it wouldn't be the slow death of submission. It would be active participation in their own fate, for better or worse. Over the following weeks, Selena learned that revolution was mostly exhausting administrative work, punctuated by moments of pure frustration. The Reform Council met daily, representatives from every territory crammed into a too-small chamber, arguing about everything from tax rates to inheritance law to the basic question of what authority the crown should actually have. Riker attended every session, and to Selena's surprise, he mostly listened. Occasionally, he'd push back on proposals that would have gutted royal power completely, but more often he just sat there absorbing criticism and adjusting his understanding of how the kingdom actually functioned outside palace walls. It was strange seeing him like this, stripped of the absolute certainty that had defined him, learning, painfully and slowly, that strength could mean flexibility rather than rigidity. 3 months into the reform process, he approached Selena after a particularly contentious session about land restoration. "Can we talk?" he asked. "Privately?" She followed him to a small courtyard, her legs still aching but mostly healed. They stood on opposite sides of a fountain, the sound of running water filling the silence between them. "I wanted to apologize," Riker said finally, "for everything, for lying about Kael, for the fertility treatments, for using you as a tool instead of treating you like a partner." Selena studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculation, found only exhaustion and something that might have been genuine remorse. "Why now?" she asked. "Why apologize after everything that's happened?" "Because I finally understand what I lost." He looked down at the water. "I spent so long focused on maintaining power that I forgot what I was supposed to do with it. Forgot that kingdoms are made of people, not chess pieces. That's quite a realization for an Alpha King." Former Alpha King. His smile was bitter. "The council made it pretty clear I'm one bad decision away from forced retirement. Is that why you're apologizing? Because you're afraid of losing what's left?" Maybe partly, but also because you were right about all of it. The corruption, the cruelty, the systematic abuse of power. I built something terrible and called it strength. He finally looked at her directly. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I see it now, see what I did to you, what I did to the kingdom. Selena felt something loosen in her chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever, but something close to closure. The understanding that he'd finally been forced to confront the consequences of his choices. I spent 7 years trying to earn your love, she said quietly, trying to be enough. And it was never about me, was it? It was always about what I could provide or how I could serve your political needs. No, that's not... He stopped, reconsidered. That's not entirely true. I did care about you, Selena. In my own broken way. I just prioritize power over everything else, including you. That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me. They stood in silence, two wolves who'd once promised to build a life together, now separated by a chasm of betrayal and violence that couldn't be bridged. But maybe it didn't need to be bridged. Maybe some relationships were only meant to teach you what you didn't want, what you wouldn't accept, what you deserved better than. I'm going to keep fighting for reforms, Selena said, even if it means fighting you. I know, and honestly, I think I prefer you this way, the version of you that fights back. He smiled slightly. The woman I married was trying so hard to be perfect that I never saw who she actually was. Who I was died in that palace. The woman standing here is someone else entirely. Then I'm glad she survived. Riker left shortly after, and Selena stayed by the fountain watching light play across moving water. She thought about everything that had brought her to this moment, the pain, the betrayal, the desperate gamble that had somehow transformed into something that might eventually resemble justice. She thought about Commander Dain, buried now with full honors despite having died fighting his king. About all the wolves who'd sacrificed everything because comfortable people rarely changed unless uncomfortable circumstances forced them to. She was one of those uncomfortable circumstances now. A constant reminder that power unchecked became tyranny, that silence enabled abuse, that sometimes the only moral choice was the dangerous one. It wasn't the life she'd planned, wasn't the romance or partnership she'd dreamed about during those early years with Riker. But it was hers, built from wreckage and blood, and the stubborn refusal to disappear quietly. Months became years. The reforms took hold slowly, each one fought for and negotiated and compromised until it resembled something workable, if not perfect. Territory representatives gained real power. Laws limiting royal authority became enshrined in kingdom tradition. The outer regions began to recover as exploitation gave way to something approaching fair governance. Selena became a fixture in the Reform Council, respected for her willingness to fight for wolves who had no other voice. She never returned to the palace as queen. That chapter had closed. Instead, she maintained her estate in the Western Territories and built a life around advocacy and occasionally uncomfortable truth-telling. Liana and Kale stayed in the palace, the boy growing into adolescence under the weight of being heir to a throne that meant something very different than it had when he was born. Selena saw them occasionally at council sessions, and the interactions were always strained but civil. The boy was innocent in all this, she reminded herself. He deserved a chance to be better than his father. Whether he'd take that chance remained to be seen. 3 years after the Blood Moon gathering, Selena stood in her training yard watching young wolves practice combat forms. She'd started offering sanctuary and training to refugees and dispossessed wolves, creating a kind of informal academy that taught both fighting skills and the political literacy required to navigate kingdom power structures. Maris found her there, older now, but still steady. The former attendant had stayed with Selena through everything. Their relationship transformed from servant and lady into something closer to friendship. "There's someone here to see you," Maris said. Selena found Elder Morvain waiting in her study, looking ancient and unbreakable as always. The old woman accepted tea with a nod of thanks. "I'm dying," Morvain said without preamble. "Have maybe 6 months left. Maybe less." Selena sat down slowly. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. I've lived longer than anyone has a right to. But before I go, I wanted to tell you something." "What's that?" "You saved this kingdom." The elder's voice was matter-of-fact. "Not alone, not perfectly. But you forced us to change when we'd have rather maintained comfortable cruelty. That matters. 37 wolves died during that gathering. and thousands didn't die in the slow, grinding violence that would have continued without reform. Morvain sipped her tea. Don't let guilt blind you to what you actually accomplished. What did I accomplish? Selena asked. We reformed some laws, redistributed some power, but the fundamental structures are still there. Riker's still king. The council still makes most decisions. How much actually changed? More than you think. Less than you hoped. That's how these things always go. The old woman set down her cup. You wanted revolution. What you got was evolution. Slower, messier, but more likely to last. Selena thought about that, about all the compromises she'd made, the ideals she'd softened, the justice she'd traded for stability. Did I sell out? She asked quietly. No. You grew up. The elder stood, leaning heavily on her staff. You learned that changing systems means working within them, even when every instinct says to tear them down and start over. That's wisdom, child. Hard-won and bitter, but wisdom nonetheless. After Morvain left, Selena sat alone in her study thinking about wisdom and compromise and the distance between the woman she'd been and who she'd become. She'd started this journey wanting revenge, wanting Riker to hurt the way he'd hurt her, wanting the entire kingdom to see and acknowledge her pain. She'd gotten some of that, but more importantly, she'd discovered something she hadn't known she needed: purpose beyond pain, identity beyond being someone's wife or queen or victim, the understanding that she could survive complete destruction and rebuild herself into something harder and more useful. That night, she dreamed about the palace. Not as it was, but as it might become. A place where power served instead of dominated, where questions were welcomed instead of crushed, where wolves built together instead of fighting over scraps. It was naive, maybe. Hopeful in ways that her younger self would have embraced and her current self knew to be complicated. But hope was dangerous that way. It kept pulling you forward even when logic said to stop, to accept that good enough was probably the best you'd get. 5 years after everything had changed, Selena received word that Riker had stepped down from the throne. Not forced out, but choosing to abdicate in favor of Kael, who'd grown into a young man with his father's strength and what people said was his mother's compassion. Riker would serve as an advisor but no longer rule. The kingdom threw a celebration. Selena didn't attend. Instead, she stood in her training yard and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of blood and gold, thought about beginnings and endings and the space between where most of life actually happened. She'd survived. That was something. Had transformed suffering into purpose and rage into reform. Had learned that real strength meant flexibility rather than dominance, that true power came from building up rather than tearing down. She'd learned, painfully and over years, that freedom wasn't the same as winning, that peace didn't require justice, though it felt better when it included some, that you could lose everything and still become someone worth being. The woman who'd stood beside the Alpha King 7 years ago was gone completely now, buried under layers of scar tissue and hard-won wisdom. In her place stood someone who understood that survival sometimes meant becoming unrecognizable to your former self. That growth required shedding skins you'd once thought defined you. She thought about Riker occasionally, wondered if he'd found any peace in his forced evolution, hoped in a distant way that he had. Not for his sake, but because grudges were exhausting and she had better things to do with her remaining years than nurse old wounds. Mostly, she thought about the future, about the young wolves she trained, the reforms still needed, the work that would outlast her by generations. She'd become part of something larger than revenge or validation or any of the things she'd wanted when this started. She'd become part of change itself, messy and incomplete and ongoing, the work of pulling a kingdom towards something better, one painful compromise at a time. It wasn't the story she'd imagined for herself, wasn't the romance or the tragedy or the triumph. It was quieter than that, more complicated. Built from 1,000 small choices to keep going when stopping would have been easier. But it was hers, earned through blood and suffering and the stubborn refusal to let betrayal be the end of her story. As darkness fell and stars began appearing overhead, Selena Voss smiled. It was a small expression, barely visible, but real. She'd survived, she'd changed, she'd mattered, and in the end, that was enough.